In the weeks between the German and Austrian Grand Prix, Japan Airlines Flight 123 crashed into the mountains of central Japan shortly after takeoff from Tokyo Haneda Airport. The aircraft, a Boeing 747 reconfigured for extra passenger capacity, was full, and 520 people were killed in what remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. Investigations concluded that the aircraft hadn't been properly repaired after an incident in 1978, and after 7 years of flight stresses, a bulkhead had given way. The next day, the production lines for the Sinclair C5 shut down after just 7 months, having built around 16,000 examples and sold just 5,000 of them. The small electric vehicle with bodywork designed by Lotus Cars, hence the JPS-branded models in the paddock at Silverstone, had been envisaged as a convenient, low-cost personal transport, but it suffered from problems including a low profile that made it disappear in traffic and a lack of weather protection for the British climate. The failure of the C5 tarnished the reputation of electric vehicles in the UK until the introduction of the Toyota Prius in 1997, but the few surviving C5s themselves became cult collector's items. In South Africa, President P.W. Botha was giving a speech to his party conference in which he was expected to announce new reforms in response to the ever-increasing violence and protests and international pressure, with some even predicting the end of apartheid and the release of Nelson Mandela. A global audience of some 200 million tuned into the TV coverage and watched Botha announce that instead he would stand firm in the face of international and domestic opposition and maintain the apartheid system. In response, the South African rand tanked, and South Africa would become ever more internationally isolated. And on the 11th of August, the 1,000 kilometres of Mosport sports car race took place in Canada, with Martin Brundle co-driving the Tom Walkinshaw Jaguar with Mike Thackwell, and Manfred Winkelhock and Mark Seurer sharing the Kramer Porsche. At the beginning of the 69th lap, Winkelhock skidded off and slammed into a concrete wall. It took nearly an hour to extract Manfred from the cockpit and clear the wreckage, and Winkelhock died of his injuries the following day. Although deaths among racing drivers were far from uncommon, Manfred had been a popular figure in the paddock, and there was a rather deflated atmosphere as the teams arrived in the Styrian Hills, with Kenny Aitchison returning to the Ram team, for whom he'd driven in the latter half of 1983. The team reassigned Philippe Alliot to the lead number 9 car, with Aitchison taking the number 10. Aitchison had spent 7 races in the Ram March car in 1983, only managing to qualify on his last attempt in South Africa. Without a drive for 1984, he'd returned to Formula 2, racing in the Japanese domestic series. While his previous stint with Ram hadn't been wildly successful, it was hardly his fault, and when the team needed a short-notice replacement for Winkelhock, they turned to Aitchison as a known quantity who could slot right into the traumatised team. The Tolman team had, as many predicted, introduced a second car which would be driven by Piercarlo Cinzani, while Brabham were forced to remove one thing they had added in Germany, a small movable vane inside one side pod that altered airflow through the coolers to aid fuel consumption, but had now been ruled a movable aerodynamic device and had to be ditched. Friday qualifying saw glorious sunshine and bumper crowds, with Senna off the pace for once, complaining about the feel of his car. Warwick was having troubles with misfires in his Renault and had to use Tombé's car, as the spare was set up with the race-spec engine in it. Unfortunately, he then promptly crashed. Patrick's reaction is not recorded. Alboreto had a similar problem but managed not to crash his teammate's car. When the dust settled on Friday, Prost was on top, but Lauda was an unaccustomed second, finally looking like the defending champion in his McLaren tag. So it was all the more of a bombshell when he called a press conference on Saturday morning to announce that he would retire from F1, for good this time, at the end of the season. Beside him sat a rather glum-looking Ron Dennis, who had reportedly offered him a fairly fat cheque to stay on. Saturday qualifying took place then in a flurry of speculation, with many drivers taking to the track with one eye on the 1986 McLaren seat. With dark clouds looming, there was also a flurry of activity as they all tried to get a good lap in before the rain arrived, which it did 10 minutes after the start of the session. 15 drivers had improved their time, while Prost hadn't gone out at all but still stayed on pole. Mansell had sneaked second from Lauda, who would therefore start on row 2 alongside Rosberg, with Piquet and Fabi proving Germany hadn't been a complete fluke in 5th and 6th. De Angelis was 7th, Tombé 8th, and Alboreto a frustrated 9th alongside Patrese after his new qualifying engine kept eating its pistons. Senna was back in 14th behind Warwick's Renault, Ghinzani 19th in the second Tollman, Aitchison 23rd and Brundle slowest of all. With 27 cars once again, Ken Tyrrell sent a petition round to allow Brundle to start, but not everyone signed it, so the race would be an all-turbo affair. By Sunday morning the weather was warm and muddy, though it had rained so much overnight that some of the car parks had to be closed, with cars being redirected to park on the nearby under-construction motorway and then spectators bussed over to the track. Despite this, there was a bumper crowd out to see what would be national hero Niki Lauda's last home race. When the lights went green on the race, Mansell was slow away, De Angelis stuttered, and Fabi next to him went nowhere at all, causing a snarl up in the midfield as the two McLarens went into the lead, chased by Piquet and Rosberg. Austrian heads craned to see and were rewarded with the sight of a red helmet and a number 1 on the lead car. Niki Lauda was in the lead. But there were 3 cars left on the grid. Fabi's engine had died, Alboreto had wiped off a front wheel on a slow-moving De Angelis, pushing him into the path of Berger just as the Austrian was trying to go between the Lotus and Fabi and demolishing the front of the Arrows. Lauda led while Prost fended off Rosberg, and Tombe had made it up to 4th ahead of Piquet, but it was all for nothing as the red flags came out. With 3 cars and debris still all over the narrow pit straight, the organisers didn't have much choice, and just like last year, the Austrian Grand Prix would need a do-over. All of which was great news for Alboreto and Berger, who could start in their respective spare cars, as did Prost, who'd been wanting to change to the spare before the race, as he thought his CV joint was sounding a bit rough. Having been prevented by the regulations initially, now he was able to do so. Tollman, meanwhile, didn't have a spare because it was currently being driven as a race car by Ghinzani. Not anymore, Piercarlo was informed, the number stickers were changed and the car given to Teo for the race. So back out went 25 cars for a second go. The lights went green again and Mansell was slow away again, Rosberg leaping round him and slotting in second between Prost and Lauda, with Piquet and De Angelis close behind. This time the start was clean, and Prost and Rosberg quickly began to pull away from Lauda, who was in turn pulling away from Piquet, De Angelis and Mansell, with Tombe 7th, Fabi 8th, Alboreto 9th, Senna 10th and Warwick 11th. Lauda lost a little more time with a slide, ironically in the Lauda chicane, while the leading pair tore off into the distance. Niki was able to recover well though and kept pace with them as the 3 behind him focused on their own battle over 4th place. That became a battle over 3rd after just a few laps, when Rosberg lost oil pressure and pulled off, to a roar from the crowd. So it was 2 McLarens out front, a rare sight so far this year, with Piquet pulling out a little on De Angelis, who now had his old sparring partner Mansell all over the back of him, and Fabi had got past Tombe and attached himself to the back of the Williams. So once more a battle for 4th place was the best racing on the track. Prost meanwhile was pulling away from Lauda, undoubtedly keen to make the most of Alboreto's troubles with the Ferrari still stuck down in 9th. Alain was certainly motoring. It only took him until lap 5 to break René Arnoux' lap record, as Tombe came in to replace a flat tyre, which promoted Senna to 7th as he'd passed Alboreto, who was now 8th. With clear track now ahead, Senna stepped on the loud pedal and charged, beginning to catch up with the De Angelis-Mansell-Fabi battle ahead of him. On lap 13, unlucky for some, De Cesaris's Ligier twitched, he put a rear wheel on the grass, and had one of the more spectacular accidents of his lively career. The car came to rest the right way up, and Andrea got out and walked away, a little shaken, and staring at the car in amazement, but otherwise unhurt. The muddied Italian received some appreciative applause from the audience, and coming just a week after Winkelhock's fatal accident, it was a heart-stopping moment all round. Perhaps the soft, rain-sodden ground helped absorb some of the impact. Fabi pitted with a misfiring engine and was soon lapped by the charging leaders, as Lauda began to close in on Prost, while off-camera Mansell had got ahead of De Angelis and was attempting to make inroads on Piquet's 3rd place. By now it was half-distance, and Prost went in for new boots, allowing Lauda through to a huge roar from the crowd. Prost had started on a harder compound than Lauda, so he could assume Niki would stop too, which would help with the gap now at 29 seconds. Mansell and Piquet both retired almost together with an engine failure and a broken exhaust respectively, and De Angelis also stopped for tyres and was out just in time to be lapped by Lauda. All of which meant that Lauda and Prost were still 1st and 2nd, leading Ayrton Senna by a comically large margin with half the race still to go, with Johansson 5th and De Angelis 6th. Lauda, still not having stopped, was being caught at about a second a lap as the race entered its final quarter, and soon we would have the battle for the lead between Prost and Lauda we had been denied all season. Except that with just 12 laps to go, Niki pulled over with a smoking engine, and we were going to have to wait a little longer. The cameras were actually momentarily pointing at Martini, who had also appeared wreathed in smoke. Heartbreaking for Lauda, but a godsend for Prost as he took the lead with no chance of losing it except by a technical failure, which was much less likely now that he could ease off and cruise home. Martini, meanwhile, was still running. His engine hadn't blown, in fact, but his rear bodywork had come loose and was rubbing on the rear wheels. A quick stop to pull it out of the way, and he continued. Senna was still a distant second, some 48 seconds back, and presumably also willing his machinery to stay in one piece, while a third-placed Alboreto, 7 seconds behind and chasing, was equally willing it to break. Johansson was fourth and dutifully keeping station behind his team leader, De Angelis was about half a minute behind the Ferraris, and Sura was now up to sixth. Something broke inside Tombé's car as he was being lapped by Johansson, causing him to twitch sideways and nearly take out the Ferrari before expiring a couple of corners later in a cloud of smoke and spinning on his own oil. He'd only had 5 more laps to complete, and Bootson's Arrows and Martini's Minardi also called it a day almost within sight of the line, while Rothengatter was struggling home with his Azella's Alfa Romeo engine running on fewer and fewer cylinders every time he came past the pits. So, Prost took his 4th win of the year, Senna came second to score his first point since winning in Portugal, and Michele Alboreto came in third for 4 points, with Johansson, De Angelis and Sura picking up the last points. As the teams packed up for the long drive to Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix in just 7 days' time, Prost and Alboreto were now equal on points, with Prost leading the table on number of wins, while McLaren clawed back 2 points from Ferrari, who were looking increasingly well set for the Constructors' Championship.